maybe I could, but I couldn't find a way. But anyways, so this topic is hyperimmunity develops delayed stored potential. And the cures department, the last 50 years, has developed a lot of delayed stored potential, of which then develops so much growth that we see a lot of died suddenly or cancer disease, chronic illness, turbo cancers, and autoimmune disorders, and also uh, a lot of awakenings within the body, mind, and spirit that happen at a very short amount of time. So let me just read this real quick because there's a lot of information. But what happened during this delayed stored potential is that people have been taking things to vasoconstrict their ability to release. They take certain cures to stop the body from experiencing symptoms. And so when all of that is put to the side, like a dam being held back by energy countering forces or a brick wall, and then there's a change in the environment and there's so much explosion of growth and development, that dam breaks. And that becomes a major energy conversion that is called a delayed stored potential. And it comes from hyperimmunity, because hyperimmunity is when you're taking so many different pills, powders, supplements, and detoxes, and the body doesn't, is not allowed to release it because they've used those to actually stop the symptoms from occurring. And so they're storing that delayed potential. So I'm gonna read all of this and then you guys can figure it out. And this is made for kids because kids should understand what happens when they're taking all these remedies, and they can talk to their doctor, talk to their parents about delayed stored potential, but it could work for them and it could work against them. That's something that you're going to talk to your doctor about, okay? So hyperimmunity develops delayed stored potential. The concept of delayed reactions to store up the energy for a major explosion in the future. That was the experiment the last 50 years, is how do you delay potential so when it's stored up, the system can release the demons and people don't survive it. And that's 2020, 2025 in the future, okay? So that was the intention of the cures market, and also all the different experiments of holding people back and potentially even withholding food, right? So they don't release, and them at a very young age. And when the environment changes, the body tries to catch up and release, or there's nothing to catch up to, or the person becomes extremely obese because everything is catching up. And that's what went on in my world the last 9 years, was catching up to all of that delayed stored potential. And then, yes, you become bigger. And that is the whole point, is to for people to store up all this information, and then when it's time, the system releases it. And that's what happens, is then people either become so triggered that they just are so out there doing the activism, or they're doing the RIOTSs, or they get huge, or they get die suddenly, okay? Or the body catches up and so much that they become obese, trying to make up for what was lost in their childhood, which is why you see young girls in high school look cute and then they end up becoming bigger, right, in their mid 40s and 50s, or they're doing so much plastic surgery and aggressive dieting. And also why people get cancer, disease, and chronic illness, because of all those remedies that were told to take when they were sick, stored up a lot of energy potential, then the explosion of all the different cancers when the climate change. So we're headed into a really hot summer, like a really, really hot, like Ohio's gonna be like 110 degrees. And that's not really normal. I mean, it is and it isn't, because the humidity is gonna be insane, everything's gonna be insane. And so that's gonna trigger a lot of things in people that are not gonna expect it. And it's a little dangerous. And so that's also why parents try to give their children so much information at a very young age. And then they hold back the food so they don't release the potential through the digestive system. And then they get all these autoimmune disorders or other hormonal imbalances or aggressive SEX because of the societal programming. And then it becomes explosions later on. And some don't survive it. And maybe some might capitalize on their potential gifts, but it doesn't last long. Okay? Because there is no balance. It's like all or nothing. Like literally, it's like all or nothing. And that's where all the treatments are for. And that's what all the treatments are for any kind of cancer, disease, and chronic illness and autoimmune disorders. It's just building up the pressure for later deadly explosions. So Anytime you treat anything, that's just putting everything to the side. Okay, but it doesn't get to the root cause. And so then that becomes the delayed stored potential. And so how long can you hold back the dam before finally it redoubles its efforts and it becomes even worse later? And that's why I keep saying every time you treat disease, it will become a worse situation later when everything finally accumulates and everything finally comes to head, or all of that life catches up to you. That's what's going on right now, is everyone's lifestyle and belief system and politics, religion, science, and remedies and all that, it's catching up to them. And that's also what happened with my dog. Everything caught up to her ever since 2019, 2020. But not realizing that those surgeries were something I had to factor in. And so anytime you get a surgery, that's something that you're also going to have to reconcile with later if you choose to go back to the beginning, so to speak, and make a different choice and then actually do the correct thing later. That's the whole back to the future, going back to the past to correct the past so you have a better future. And so the last 9 years was me catching up to everything I did all the way up to yesterday, which is why you're seeing such an explosion of awareness and intellectual capability and making the connections. Okay, so I studied so much the last 9 years, and I had my own University of Jillian. Okay, it's not magic, it's the physics, and everything is connected. So when I asked Google, what is that concept when you hold things back and then it springs forward even more aggressive than what you held back? Well, this is what Google said. While not a specific term for the phenomenon you described, the concept you're referring to, where a delay in action leads to increased speed later, can be understood in physics through the interaction between potential energy and kinetic energy, especially in situations involving conversion and release of energy. Here's how these concepts can relate to your ideas. Potential energy. Think of pulling back a bowstring. You are storing potential energy in the stretched string. Okay, that's putting stress and potential energy in your back arm to then release, and then all of that is then pushed forward. And so the energy of motion, right? A moving arrow has kinetic energy. The relationship, when you delay an action, that's all the pills, supplements, and detoxes and everything, the vasoconstriction, the vasodilation, but really vasoconstriction. The delay in action, like holding the bowstring back, you are essentially allowing more potential energy to be stored. When you finally release or stop the delay, the stored potential energy is then converted into kinetic energy, causing the object, the arrow, in the example, to accelerate and move with increased speed. Springs, when you compress a spring, you are storing potential energy in it. When you release the spring, this potential energy is converted to kinetic energy, causing an object pushed by the spring to move. Gravity, a rock held at a height has a gravitational potential energy. When you drop it, this potential energy is converted into kinetic energy as it falls and speeds up. So the higher you drop something, the faster it speeds up and more deadly. So when you drop something at a lower height, it doesn't have the time to pick up energy, so it's not as deadly. But when you're dropping a penny from like 50 stories up, that can hurt somebody. All right. And so a roller coaster at the top of the hill has a lot of potential energy. As it descends, this potential energy is transformed into kinetic energy, causing the coaster to gain speed. In these scenarios, the delay in releasing the stored energy potential results in a greater speed, kinetic energy upon release. And that's what the cures market, that's what hyperimmunity does. So when you're saying you want to be cured and you want to be hyperimmune and you never get sick, that is deadly. When you never get sick and you always want to cure your sickness with everything, with all these un-FDA approved types of supplements and drugs that is so rife in the MLM market, in the holistic market, that's when people set themselves up to have an extraordinary situation that they can't get ahead of. And so that's why I kept saying all of your drugs and your operations and all of your remedies and your pills and your powders and your supplements and detoxes and your Rife machines and all of that is basically developing a really horrible situation later on when the climate change has become so hot that it wakes up those demons. And that's what I've been experiencing the last 9 years. So I had to be sick. If I were to take anything in the market, even whatever a doctor would recommend, I would then be developing another potential for a worse situation later on. And that's why I stay away from the activism world. I am out of the health and wellness industry because they're developing potentials of people that they're going to blame on the VACC, whatever, and everything else. I mean, all the IVERMECTINs that people are recommending, that's another delayed stored potential that's going to be deadly later on. But you can't tell people anything. And so if you have an issue and you can't control, go see a doctor. But to listen to all these little demigods and Facebook gurus who are going to develop such hyperimmunity in people, they are setting people up for a major disaster later on. And that train has left the station because you saw how popular and how influential these gurus are with their starvation diets and all of their supplements and shit. So, I'm done with all of that. But I wanted to complete and connect the last idea about hyperimmunity and then hyperimmunity resulting in a delayed stored potential. And that is the diet settling world and the turbo cancers. All right, bye.